Union, in the like last couple of years of its existence, you do end up getting some amount of reforms that occur in regards to stuff like transparency or in regards to stuff like accountability mechanisms that do exist, right? Which means that at all points in time, the likely alternative to us saying that the Soviet Union collapses is that the Soviet Union gets some amount of reforms, which means you probably get stuff like freer press or like more transparency or less crackdowns from the authoritarian state, while at the same time being able to continue with its existence, which means a couple of things, right? I'll be proving to you three large outcomes or like three large arguments in this debate. Firstly, how we get better practical outcomes within the USSR, like the Warsaw Pact states generally. Two things under this. Firstly, I just want to say that this probably leads to a large amount of avoidance of harms that existed in the status quo, right? Which means when you're understanding how the Soviet Union collapsed and the impact that it has, this is a collapse that occurred entirely overnight, which means you got a large number of people who were dependent on a state that was like entirely centralized and entirely controlled by an institute, like by the government, and this government completely collapses, which means one, there's a large amount of people who are entirely dependent on this state for their very survival who are unable to do this anymore, which means they are pushed to enter stuff like crime, or they're pushed into situations of extreme poverty within the first place. That means there's a significant like worsening in the quality of life that they have at all points in time. But then secondly, the way in which this like collapse happens immediately is that you've got the existence of oligarchs or people who are in extremely powerful positions who are then able to buy up large amounts of state property at very, very low prices, and they're able to amass a lot of this. Which means that even in case there's any other issues that do exist in regards to inequality existing or a large number of people within the Soviet Union, then like leading to like opt- being pushed into lives of continued and like very like absolute poverty, that probably only happens at the point when you do get this sudden collapse, which gives these oligarchs the ability to amass all of this like state property, and which leads to all of the further impacts that you talk about, in the sense that you get no economic development, you get the economy contracting by as much as 50%, and you then get also the institution of very, very unstable alternatives. So firstly, on the economical level, we're able to tell you, one, there's the existence of a large number of dependents as a result of this who are deprived of the ability to lead a good quality of life. But then two, you lead to structural problems that even exist within the status quo, where you give the power to the oligarchs to be able to worsen the type of economic development you have by virtue of the fact they have perverse incentives compared to the Soviet Union. Also, just on the level of how this impacts the status quo, we're able to tell you, in case there exists bad institutions on a global level today, i.e., say Russia being a very, very bad institution, or just the various like states in Eastern Europe or the post-Soviet states being very, very badly run, that happens because the concentration of power and economic wealth is in the hands of very, very few, by virtue of this being the way in which the collapse happens. At the point when we tell you this simply does not occur, we're able to tell you a lot of those impacts never materialize. That's a better quality of life for a large number of people, which is probably a very, very good thing simply on the level of magnitude of impact, right? But then secondly, I think we're able to tell you, you get a very, very significant improvement of conditions like on the comparative and our side of house, even in a political sense. Because at the point when you've got suddenly a breakdown in like the type of states that you have within the Soviet Union, which means you've got the existence of various nationalistic and ethnic groups who are trying to seek stuff like independence for themselves individually, they probably also end up instituting stuff like significant crackdowns on the people, by virtue of that being the only mechanism that they have, or the only way in which they're able to do stuff like restore stability or like access any form of power. Which means that the only way in which you get the institution of stuff like more authoritarian regimes following the collapse of the Soviet Union is by virtue of the fact that this body no longer exists, and there's the existence of people who want to be able to access power and have no alternative means to do so. Which means
POI?
one, the other side simply cannot come and tell you some like fancy story that okay, everybody is suddenly very, very happy because you get democracy, insofar as that's a very, very low impact that's limited to very, very few states, wherein the alternative is that you've got many more states who end up like being pushed into situations where you've got even worse governments that are less accountable and are instituting worse levels of policies. So then on the comparative, when we say that like in our framing and the clarification that the Soviet Union not collapsing probably looks like some amount of reform and some amount of democratization, that probably
Yours,
does happen on our side of the house, which is the best alternative compared to what you get on opposition bench, right? Before moving on, sure, I'll take that.
Why do you
Closing.
think the Soviet Union collapsed?
Soviet Union collapsed because it was like actively it was actively warring with the it was actively engaging in the Cold War. It was like expending money in places that were bad. It was like taking part in a lot of like bad allocations and stuff, which I think you probably end up solving on our side of the house, with like the alternative being reforms that do happen at the end of the Soviet Union. We're just saying we assume those to be a likely like successful outcome on our side of the house. Second layer of argumentation, it's like second argument, right? How you probably get better geopolitical outcomes or better like situations in general within Eastern Europe and within the post-Soviet world in general, right? I think firstly we're able to tell you the institution of the states that you get following the Soviet Union are less internationally accountable actors, in the sense that one, they're already like strict dictatorships by virtue of that being the only means that the governments have to be able to access power within the first place. But then secondly, these are also states that probably do not have that same level of organization or have that same level of internal accountability within them, or that same level of ability to prevent stuff like just governments making bad decisions like that lead to the escalation of conflict. But also in that sense, I think even within the Soviet Union, there's the existence of a large amount of problems that used to happen, which means the Soviet Union allocated certain ethnic groups in ways that were bad, which means you do end up getting stuff like ethnic conflict and all of that happening. The point of difference being that in case the Soviet Union has the unique ability to resolve that when it is one unified body on the other, on our side of the house, on the other side of the house, you get the breakdown into individual states, which means that when you look at conflicts that exist today, which are very, very prevalent, i.e., say the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where like Armenia and Azerbaijan are fighting at all points in time over ethnic differences. That only happens at the point when the Soviet Union is not a larger arbiter which is able to prevent stuff like that. Which means you get a large amount of conflict happening only on the other side of the house by virtue of the fact the Soviet Union is no longer able to regulate. But also on another level, right? I think the only counterbalance you get to the West or you get to capitalism is the Soviet Union, because it was the only body that was ever powerful enough to be able to actively challenge the West for a large number of years. At the point when it collapses, you give power to institutions like the US, which are not accountable, and go and like wage various conflicts in the Middle East or wage various conflicts across the world in order to fulfill their own incentives. There's a lack of any form of deterrent structure that exists, which means one, there's like a lack of any form of call out, which is able to regulate them. But two, this is just bad because it means there's a large amount of this negative conflict that does end up happening on the other side of the house. Just wrapping up now, what are we exclusively able to tell you? One, there's the existence of just better outcomes for people within the USSR and more Warsaw Pact, because you get better economic outcomes and better stability. Two, we're able to tell you geopolitical outcomes are better. Thirdly, we're able to tell you we avoid the power vacuum. So proud to propose.
All right. I thank PM for that very fine speech. Just a reminder to the speakers, nothing after 7:15 is noted down. Inviting Ellen.
Hi, just to confirm if I'm clearly audible.
Yep, you're audible.
Great. Um, POI strictly through chat. I'll definitely take one at 5:30. CG, I'll ask for it. Um, if my voice cracks or if I drop out, just let Snigdha know. Starting speech. In 3, 2, 1. Panel, OG takes a clear fourth simply because of the virtue. They don't prove the likelihood of the frame that they set up. They never prove why, just because of the virtue, that there have been certain instances of reforms within Russia in status quo. Is it likely that it would have happened in the side that they are defending? Because note, it's a prefers motion. What is then the side that we are defending? Note on just right top of my speech, a clarification. Note how the time at which USSR was consolidated, it was a dictatorship. What does that mean? The sort of cult of personality and the prerogative that was largely run within the state was that dictatorship is the most amazing form of government, and that was something that the people within the state also largely agreed with. Which means that there were no incentives for just the state to ever change and become more liberal. What is the impact of that? The impact looks like these countries like Russia, Hungary, Croatia, and all these union states remaining consolidated, which means the most likely outcome in Gov's world, and which is what they have to defend in this debate, is that the consolidation would have led to the retainance of this dictatorship in their side of the house. It's likely because of the sort of historical precedence that is set in place. What happens in our side of the house then? We think the comparative is absolutely worse for a couple of reasons. One, note how there is going to be an absolute absence of any wave of liberalization. Why is it likely? Note how when you talk about things like interference by media, and by having control over media, note how there are incentives for the dictator to always crack down on media and probably brainwash people into buying the narratives as to why state is the best actor in terms of probably achieving any of the humanitarian benefits that they can possibly give to their state, to their citizens. It's likely for a couple of reasons. Note how in There Should the House, the youth is always going to be cramped down for a couple of reasons. One, we think it's important to the state that it's able to maintain its legitimacy. It is done through ways like, oh, you go ahead and probably cramp down on watchdog bodies, things like media, things like any sort of discourse and dissent that is likely going to happen in There Should the House, which means all of these things being absent is the worst impact in their side, simply because one, it's important for you to have these watchdogs if you want to call out the dictator, but secondly, if you want to just like exercise your power and your freedoms within the state, you need access to these sorts of just like state machineries in general. Why is it bad on a principle level? We think it's principally bad because you never allow democracy to permeate in There Should the House, because the state is always going to probably cram down on your abilities and your just like civil liberties. How does the state do that in There Should the House? The state power principle, simple, couple of reasons to just justify this. One, we think the state restricts your freedom in ways that, oh, it's going to leverage taxes on you, it's going to probably cram down your just like freedom through things like military and police, etc. But secondly, note how even if birth lottery means that we don't choose, if that's something that Gov want to rationalize, we don't choose where we are born, but we still think we don't consent to our freedoms being ripped down as it happens in There Should the House. But thirdly, note how the state in their side can now have a larger leverage in terms of just violently restricted your freedom. What is the impact of all of this? The impact is that quality of life in There Should the House is going to be likely worse off. But secondly, note how the impact of this governance within like dictatorship is going to be bad. Note how in their side the default becomes that, oh, dictatorship is going to be the only norm when you are probably governing this particular country. The comparative is absolutely worse off, simply because the people as an impact, the people who are just like future generations that are going to enter politics are also going to become authoritarians, etc., etc. And the impact of that is largely worse off, simply because of the humanitarian harm that happens in There Should the House. A couple of reasons why it's likely that this setup is never going to change in their side. Note how people are in general accustomed to the idea of this sort of state and the state machinery. But second, note how the way like proximity biases work, right? Which means that when these countries and the borders to these countries are largely the same, which means the sort of cultural exchanges that you have and the sort of ideological exchanges that you have are literally echo chambers, which means that the proximity validation that you get in terms of seeing that how everybody else around you is going to replicate the same ideals, etc., etc., means that it's unlikely that this dictatorship is ever going to change in There Should the House. But then what is the comparative in their side? We think a couple of things happen, and this is important. Note how we think in their side, USSR and China are likely going to become allies. It's important for a couple of reasons, and there is just like larger likelihood to why that is true. One, we think the sort of leadership that they have is extremely similar, which means that both of them are dictatorships. But two, the sort of ideological similarities that they have, which means both of them follow the communist regimes, which means the sort of incentives that they have to push for things like social credit system, because note how that's an important characteristic of having a dictatorship, because if you don't have things like these to probably be able to give to probably be able to make the citizens in your country believe that your dictatorship is good, you can't probably leverage that without the existence of social credit system and stuff like that. The impact of that is bad. Why is it bad? It's bad because note how you're probably going to have just like two big or just like two big just like powerhouses that are governing the global politics, which looks like US and then USSR and China together. That is bad as an impact, because note how it's a threat to Western liberal democracies. Note how that's absolutely worse. I'll give more mic on that, but before that, sure, yeah.
You are describing what the USSR did in our timeline, where they cracked down on people and told them to shut up when they pushed against them. That led to the collapse. Why would it succeed on your side if it didn't in reality?
If you want to claim that that's the reason why USSR collapsed, you also need to then give frame and make as to why it's unlikely that all of these things are still not going to perpetuate, which means we'll give you extensive mech on why it's likely that the kind of setup that the USSR has been running on is the only setup that people are going to subscribe to, and the sort of rationale that they can probably make their citizens believe and run on. But then beyond this, we think it's this USSR-China allyship is extensively bad, simply because note how like China is probably the sort of similarities that they have. China has been able to debt trap Africa, but USSR has things like important access to resources, stuff like natural gas, which means that the only problem then becomes that the world is becoming largely polarized in their south, which is likely bad for developing world. But then note how even if the best push that can come from GUP is that there's going to be that there's somehow not going to be annexation of Ukraine. We think that Ukraine is also going to likely be bad in their side. Note how the exploitation is still going to likely happen in their side, because now USSR is going to have an incentive to probably increase its hold within Ukraine because of the fact that it has just like natural resources and oil, and all of these things are important. Note how the states still have incentive to curb dissent within Ukraine, even if Gov wants to say that youth will want to become liberal and youth will want to push for more liberal reform, stuff like that. We think that individual benefit is never catered to for Ukraine because of larger like cultural clashes and stuff like that. Snigdha will extend never been prouder to oppose voto.
All right. I thank Elo for that very fine speech, inviting DPM whenever they're ready.
Hi, people. Oh, this was happening. Great. Yeah, Arnav, stop texting me. People can hear it. I know this. Good. Yeah. I'll be starting. I take POIs specifically in the chat. Don't unmute if that's possible. I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. An authoritarian, concentrated communist state is amazing for 5 reasons. First, better resource distribution. At all points of time, resource is scattered across multiple geographical areas. One centralized state is able to bring all of it together, distribute amongst people. This means people aren't disadvantaged because of the geographical area they are part of. But second, resources are distributed across people on a random basis. In more instances, a communist state is far more likely to pull everything into it and therefore redistribute it better. O and CO has to prove Soviet Union wants to produce new innovation so that they can sell it internationally. Even if you claim that Marxist states have no domestic incentive, they have international incentive to advance. If they figure out the vaccine first, they would be able to sell it and make a lot of money, which means more innovation. Third, better security. All these smaller countries would not have very good armies because population is sparsely concentrated, but second, they do not have enough money and geographical resources through which they can make a lot of income, but also they are constantly in fighting, and therefore there is no arbitrator to solve it, which means at all points of time you have better security for all these small states, but you have better security for Soviet nation because in and of itself it has a larger boundary to protect, it has a larger boundary, larger access to sea, larger access to everything else, which also means that a lot of landlocked countries in this particular place have now access on our side of the house to sea resources, to every kind of trade route, means all of them are far more likely to economically develop better, which means larger economic development. But also, at the point when there are no international boundaries, no tariffs, all these countries are likely to trade with each other far easily because there is no import duties they have to pay. The businesses are far more likely to prosper because you do not have access to one market, but multiple markets, because of which all these countries get richer, the economy also grows. The last thing I want to talk about is more international negotiating power. A lot of small states that emerge have no power at all. More often than not, are getting bullied by either US or NATO or Europe, or in some instances, the Saudi Arabian countries. We think this is terrible because they have no international negotiating power at this point. If they are with Soviet Union, they have large-scale international negotiating power, and therefore all of them are better off. There are 3 ways you should weigh this. First, certainty. Everything that would be argued on the basis of IR is uncertain and speculative. This, in and of itself, is particularly certain. Second, please remember, Arnav argued to you why in short term all countries suffered, because when you differentiate, you come up with new currency, new economic systems, new institutions. More often than not, your business connections go away, which means none of you ever make any money on op, which means all of you do economically better. This means all of the people on our side of the house live in comparison to where on their side of the house everyone dies. But also for a large instance, I don't think people who are in poverty care about political rights. I, as a poor person, I don't care about going out and protesting on the street. I significantly care about having food on the table, which means in the global east, where significant number of people are poor and an agricultural economy exists, a lot of these individuals are far more likely to care about food and care about economy better. My sixth argument here is that you're far more likely to get economic revolution or economic restructuring across all states better because you have a better network of connections. But also, a lot of these smaller countries aren't able to economically restructure themselves and thereby remain an agricultural economy, while Russia could. At the point when you, as a Soviet Union, stay together, that economic shift to manufacturing and everything happens together. Again, it's an additional mechanism for economic growth. Now let me respond to everything that came from O. But before that, none of it is comparative. Russia still cracks down. A lot of these countries like Belarus still cracks down. I'm not sure why any of this is comparative coming from their side of the house. But more importantly, the debate operates on the assumption that to an extent, the Soviet Union would not fall on our side of the house. CO comes up with reasons as to why it fell. All those reasons are likely to be addressed, because of which it would not fall. Do we need to give incentives? CG would do that for you. We don't care. But more often than not, the demand of the motion is to make sure that the Soviet Union never falls, which means all the reasons are likely to be addressed in some way or other. For instance, if there were civil conflicts existing, the state has an incentive to solve this because it economically hinders their ability to progress, because there is a conflict, economics is screwed up. But also, at the point when they have internal conflicts, they aren't able to fight with the US very good, which means they also have an incentive to become better. For multiple incentives, states they would make things better. But also, we don't have to absolutely prove that it becomes a democracy. It would still remain a Marxist state. I agree with it. But it would simply stop cracking down, because cracking down led to most of the civil unrest, which is far more likely to get better. If they want the Soviet Union to stay in one place, they have the incentive to do so, because the people who control power in Soviet Union wanted to control power in a longer period of time. But also, if they control the entire Soviet Union, they have more power, which means they have all incentives to solve this. I will take CO.
Why are you painting it to be the European Union? A lot of the decisions of USSR are based on the premier of Russia. Russia decides what goes and what does not, which means most of it is likely still concentrated to one country. How exactly do any of the candidates ever come forward?
Prove it. Okay, it's not true. At the point when you actually frame yourself as a communist country and you say everyone should have equal resources, at all points of time, you have an incentive to make sure that things are distributed across all places. But also, assuming, and this is your best case, that Russia has everything, there is always, spillover effect, where Russia develops, everyone else develops a little bit more. You have to prove on your side of the house, these small countries with independent economies become better. Give us good explanation on that, and maybe we would buy into you. But for all the reasons that I gave you, more innovation, more economic development, better security, better international negotiating power, more economic growth, more resource redistribution. These are all independent reasons to vote for us. But please understand, them responding to one of this or five of this doesn't matter. Unless they take down all of this, please understand all of these reasons are independent paths to victory, which means them weighing against one of this is not enough. They have to weigh against all of these reasons independently. If they can't do that, they lose. But at all points of time, please remember my weighing on why economic capacity or individuals who have nothing, food and economic development for them means much more than political liberty. I have also proved to you why political liberalization can be possible, but also everything that comes from up is uncomparative. Very proud to propose.
All right. I thank DPM for that very fine speech, inviting Dialog to wrap up the case from Popo.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Great. I take POIs via voice. Please interrupt me, but kindly do that after the 5th minute. I definitely take you. Okay. Yeah. So once again, POIs via voice. I'm not at all looking at the screen, so interrupt me. But I take closing government. All right. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I think there's 2 clashes that I want to talk about. First, on form of governance, and secondly, on geopolitics. But notice the framing, right? government is correct to point out that Russia is still going to be an illiberal democracy. You are still going to have the countries that were part of the USSR are still probably going to be illiberal democracies. The comparative is when you have a unionization, you make dictatorship to be the default. Why is this likely? Because with you learn of different trends in governance when you are able to view what is happening over across your borders. When the countries proximate to you are following the same dictatorship as you are unlikely to ever want to question that or unlikely to ever envision a world that can be better. I'm going to talk about why exactly dictatorship is something that's so much worse, but also note that fragmentation of the USSR is something that has helped people break out and help people realize that the shackles under which they are living is actually an illiberal democracy. The best example of this is Poland, right? When Poland went ahead and banned abortion, there was tremendous call out and tremendous protest against this, only because there was like Western influence to say that abortion is probably a constitutional right that you should be able to afford. On their comparative, you have to crack down on any such kind of dissent, which means that if the USSR is likely to exist, what it is, and this is also responding to like closing government's POI, right, wherein they tell me that, oh look, USSR collapsed because it was like illiberal and conflict ridden. Why will it continue to do that? I think it's unlikely that the USSR ever becomes uncommunistic. Rather, what it is going to do is crack down on any sort of forms of dissent or any avenues of dissent possible. So think about what China does, right? China doesn't have access to WhatsApp. China doesn't have like access to our forms of tech. Rather, they have their own versions of tech, which is significantly controlled by the state. I think that is something what is going to happen with the USSR. You don't really get access to any sort of Western liberal ideas, which Divya has proved to you to be so important to the quality of lives to people. Cool. I want to respond to opening opposition on their idea of authoritarianism under governance is a good thing, and therefore it should be the norm and all that stuff, right? We tell you reasons why like dictatorship is likely to continue to be a norm, because you have to consolidate the USSR and USSR is huge, by the way, right? It's an entire gamut of countries. You need to be able to consolidate your military might, and you can probably only do that through dictatorship. They say that this authoritarianism is good because good redistribution of resources, etc. I have like about four reasons why this is unlikely. I think most predominantly, authoritarianism interbreeds corruption in the worst forms, right? There's four reasons. There's like multiple ways why this happens. One, it facilitates and creates political dynasties. Look at Kim Jong-un and how his governance how his government is either fed up with his own cronies or or like his family members, like people like his sister who are his ambassadors, right? Second, the only sort of incentive that you have is not actually to the people, but rather to the government of the state, right? Because the narrative within these dictatorships is that the state is equal to the government. What this means is that everything that they talk about with respect to, oh, poor will be now better off because they get better redistribution of resources, it is unlikely to happen. If anything, the only way that you are able to make sure that you are getting any sort of reform is by bootlicking the government, right? Which we think is bad because it deprives you of choice of other options or like other jobs that you could do. But even if I don't like convince you of that, right, I still think poor people are likely to remain poor on their side because the authoritarian parties have the biggest incentive to be catering to the oligarchies, to be catering to like make sure that these oligarchs keep getting richer, as opposed to catering to like the poorer people within their community. But more importantly, why poor people like remain poor or like they remain on like menial jobs is because there's no watchdog on the state or like or no watchdog on the government or like no other regulatory body that can check and say what the government is doing is wrong. But even if I don't convince you of any of this, and and the gov is right to prove that authoritarianism is good, I still think it's principally unjust, and you should probably allow for a democracy, even if it's a bad democracy, right? I think the reason for this is simple state power principle. There's three prongs to that. First, the state restricts your freedoms in like multiple ways, right? It takes taxes from you, it can rally forces against you, like with the police, military, etc. But also, birth lottery means that you cannot choose where you are born, which means that you don't really consent to your freedom being ripped out just because you live under an authoritarian state. Which means that the only way that you are able to have some sort of reciprocity against a state that is curbing down on your freedom is by living in a democracy. Why is this clash so important, and why have I spent so much time on it? Because the quality of governance and the control that you have on people reflects the impact on the maximum number of lives, which means that anything that closing has to run with respect to like conflicts, etc., is not as important. Because I think that like opening government is correct to point out that governance and the quality of the like governance especially has the most certain impact with respect to the number of lives impacted, and we tell you why exactly you exercise most control of lives through governance. Geopolitics then. Divya analyzes that USSR and China are likely to become allies, and this is bad for multiple reasons. It means that one, you're creating strong arm personalities to be at the helm of maximum number of resources of the world, right? She's told you that like China is able to control all of the African resources, which looks like several rare earth several elements which also before I move on, I take CG. I have like 1 minute. No?
Can you
All right.
name one large country that was a socialist country and then survived by becoming a stronger dictatorship, not liberalizing, but becoming
Okay,
even
okay.
more authoritarian?
Look. I get this, right? And this is something that I preempted in my first minute too. It is unlikely that on your side, Russia just suddenly doesn't become a communist or suddenly become a democracy to accommodate people, right? Look, I think you need to do significant amount of legwork in that to prove why this sort of governance is going to change. Cool, then geopolitics and why this is worse, right? US and USSR becomes too powerful, and the United States and the other Western liberal democracies don't have certain allies, right? Because what is the comparative? The US has allies like Saudi Arabia, which are uncertain because Saudi Arabia like is pissed at the United States for like going ahead and supporting US-Israel relationships. It's pissed in the United States because it like goes ahead and violently hates Zionism and all that stuff, right? What this means is that at the worldly level, you have China and USSR having maximum amount of power, them having maximum control, which means that there's worse trade outcomes. Yeah, could not be prouder to oppose.
All right. I thank DLO for that very fine speech. With that, we come to the end of the debate in the top half, inviting MG to start closing half.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep. Sorry for the delay. You're audible and visible.
Okay, no problem. I will take opening opposition. You can ask me, however, at whatever time because I can't decide when you ask me a POI. Okay. Opening opposition severely misunderstands how the burdens here work. We know for a fact that the USSR in reality collapsed after being highly authoritarian and highly angry and disturbing in the way that it implemented its policies. That is something that is impossible to dispute in this debate. The alternative world they describe is one where they use the same tactics but succeed. The problem is all they give are reasons as to why they will want to use the same tactics, not why they will succeed, other than just the fact that some people might be scared. What I'm going to tell you is the world in which they succeed is a world in which they significantly decentralize and become significantly less authoritarian. But one thing I want to point out right now is first, opening government does not make this and is dependent on it. Why? Prime Minister does not give you reasons, they give you assertions. They say when the government collapsed, there was crime and there was huge amounts of people who depended on the government and got nothing from it. Again, the assumption the government did help those people before it collapsed and the new governments didn't. No analysis for why. The second thing is secession started becoming really common, and that means that people started wanting to fight each other, and the government used to be an arbiter and used to stop conflicts. Why? No idea as to why the government succeeded. And then Anshuman gives 5 reasons that assume the government is good. The first reason, resources are moved around, which assumes a good government. Second, People start to work together and put all their smartest minds for innovation. Assumes the government is good. Security becomes concentrated so they don't fight each other. Assumes the government is good. All of these assume the government is good and don't prove it. So the PM asserts a frame, DPM tries to win on it. This obviously beats opening opposition because all of their totalitarian evil stuff has one missing button as well. What about the actual states that formed after the fall of the USSR? Have you seen modern day Russia? It is significantly more authoritarian than anything you describe, and so is Belarus and every other country in that region. So I do not understand why they would have liberalized on your side, and you don't give me reasons for them, so I don't understand how you can win them. What do? We explain to you why the new states were more authoritarian and more economically devastated, and the old state of the USSR would have become better. First, let's fill the gap opening government is missing. Opening opposition gives you 3 reasons as to why you would have had to be authoritarian, and it would have worked. The first reason is there is a precedence, and that precedence is a cult of personality. Presumably, in the world where the USSR did not fall down, that would be a world where people did not have anger towards the same cult of personality and instead trusted the government. Well, one person could never have been someone people trusted enough. No one can trust Stalin enough in the first place. They would require to trust their local governments and other people who look like them and act like them based on tangible actions. So presumably, the cult of personality failed in the real world because people cannot relate to the same person when they obviously harm their state when they make difficult decisions. Hence, you would have had different leaders. That's the only realistic way you would have trusted the state. The second mechanism is the media will brainwash you by putting you in an echo chamber and attacking the youth. Except the media cannot brainwash you if there is other media you also see. And the only reason is you'll stop the Americans from it. Except we know historically the Americans were showing people things like what West Germany looked like in East Germany, or people from American states in the neighboring regions like Southeast Asia and East Asia were going to these people and showing them what their life looked like, which is why even in North Korea, people understand that their lives are not as good as they expect them to be. But also because businesses which were international and would have continued becoming international would have made them realize the world outside looked better than them. But third, they say people are accustomed to the state machinery, and that means you need to lick their boots, as DLO talks about, and becomes unionized leaders. Otherwise, you won't be able to gain any power. Except the state presumably would have become weaker at the point it made less money in the first place. So if it was the case that the state was becoming significantly centralized and was the only way for you to make money, then the state would have had to sell things internationally and make products that it would then make money on in order to be important. That's where it would get its resources from. Except to do that, the state would actually need to be efficient. So even if it's the case that you need to only be good if the state likes it, in order for the state to be efficient, they would have needed to encourage local competition anyway, which is why in reality, the Kazakhstan Soviet and the Soviet in Tajikistan and the Soviet in Azerbaijan and the Soviet in Armenia were different Soviets which used different methods. So even though it's true that you had to work with the central government, the method by which that government works comes from internal competition, which is what succeeded. The problem was that Stalin was too authoritarian to do any of this and tried to protect himself in the ways OO describes. So these are the reasonable ways in which the government would have survived on our side. Finally, independent set of reasons as to why crackdown would not have worked on their side. Well, because militaries revolt eventually. They become angry at killing their own families. But second, this cuts against other regions where other people often literally become more effective than you, and hence you can't make money anymore. And third of all, this destroys your capacity to move forward, because if you're an unstable, protest-focused government, which is constantly putting down crackdowns, which have many reasons to be, continuing, then often you can no longer use the resources in your area. No one wants to invest anymore. All of this means you cannot work with crackdowns. Eventually, every government does liberalize. The easiest thing to do here is to allow things like small levels of elections and some level of buy-in. It allows things like negotiating with community leaders where local regions would have had a bit more independence. That's how the USSR would have survived. Now that I've defended the most important part of this debate, which is the frame, I'm going to tell you what would have happened and why it's better than what did happen right now. What is your POI?
We've told you that unionization is still going to remove any chances of any liberalization. But on our side, this is still better, even if you make like some form of liberalization. With time, we have more certainty because fragmentation allows for better Western influence.
Wait, why? Why? Fragmentation allows for better influence. Why? Because there were proxy wars after the fall of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia broke up and they all tried to kill each other because there were still Russian supporters who didn't like the support, which means that a lot of times it's difficult for these governments to work with the West because they distrust them. But the Russian people did trust them. And as a result, they got huge amounts of influence over them, but without the obligation to give them money, which was bad. Okay, what happened when the government stays together? First, note that what happens in China happens here. First, all the benefits that DPM talks about then become our benefits. First, resources are reallocated at the point where there's decentralization because you have to compete with each other in order to be efficient, which means that the richest countries often are forced to give some taxes to the smaller countries, but also the smaller countries have to use it in a way that's efficient as opposed to what happens now. What happened on our side? What OG said, privatization where oligarchs tried to own the economy, which was bad because the money went to the investors from MNCs who would then move it abroad. And second, the local demand wasn't rising. The market wasn't strong. That means that the infrastructure might have been important, but the people in that region weren't, in which case you use them as labor, but not as demand, which means that the economy did not grow. It just became a part of a supply chain that harmed others. But second, as the state becomes powerful, all the negotiating benefits from DPM also become a CG benefit because now you can force other people to give you better trade deals instead of what has happened right now, where Belarus is literally subservient to Russia, where Serbia has been destroying the Croatian economy for the past few decades, and now it's flipping because Croatia got support from the European Union. This kind of cooperation is obviously better for these nations. On that, we get OG's benefits, closing government.
All right, I thank MG for that very fine speech, inviting Mo to start their case from CO.
Yup, my name is Dhruv Singh, preferred gender pronouns /him. I'll take POS from opening government after 5 minutes and 30 seconds. I'll start in 30 seconds. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you're both.
Yup. Yup. Starting my speech. In 3. Yup, starting my speech.
Just a second, am I the only one who can't hear Dhruv, or is he not audible?
The
They
same
aren't
goes.
audible.
The camera is also frozen, so I think it's an
I
internet
asked
issue.
Dhruv to join again.
Am I still audible? I think my net got broken off.
Yep, you're audible and visible.
All right, so I'll just restart my speech. Yep. From leg 00, I'll restart.
Dhruv, wait, now my internet is acting up. Give me just 30 seconds.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Yep. Starting my speech. Starting my speech in Yep. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. And go. The problem with opening government and closing government combined is that they assume negotiation can even happen in the first place. Why is negotiation not possible? Negotiation is not possible because people on the ground disagreed with the core principles of communism in the first place to begin with, which is to say Soviet Union wanted like centralization and control and ownership of the land of people. It wanted to decide how production would happen, but how you would need to produce specific crops on a particular time period in the first place to begin with, which means different groups in different areas which wanted to break free from this, they disagreed on core principles because they wanted to own their own property. They wanted to decide what they need to produce, and these core principles cannot be something which can be negotiated with, and that is something that cannot be done in their side of the world. But the second thing to note here is like direct rebuttals to opening government. Opening government assumes that resource distribution can happen, but this assumes that like Soviet Union was stable, but their leader was rational to begin with. We think Soviet Union wasn't rational because of two reasons. Number one, Soviet Union was an irrational actor because it wanted to increase its power, because it was involved in an arms race deal with USA, and it spent humongously and irrationally on its defense budget, even at the cost of the domestic people suffering in the first place to begin with. This happened because Soviet Union wanted to protect its security and it wanted more amount of arms and defense spending, but this came at the cost of the local people suffering and not getting the food which Soviet Union promised in the first place. But the second thing to note here is trade happens better in our side for these smaller countries. When smaller countries got their freedom and got their liberation, it gave them the chance to look at their domestic conditions and decide the form of governance and decide how imports and exports need to happen within those smaller countries in the first place to begin with. OG assumes they don't have negotiating power. Two reasons that they do have negotiating power. Number one, they have a strategic location which is important for allies in the West, which is to say it gives them the negotiating power to get better contracts because they're the strategic location, because they were included and they were near Russia in the first place. But the second reason, they had their own niche resources which like the West wanted, and they had the ability to negotiate contracts for them, and that is why we get that in our side of the world. But panel, what is our case and why is it so important? The first thing to note here is that Soviet Union was very, very weak and the people were very unhappy. There was a little referendum happened and people voted because they wanted to opt out of Soviet Union in the first place to begin with. But the two reasons that led to the falling of Soviet Union are important. Number one, irrational defense spending because they were in an arms race deal with USA. But secondarily, centrally controlled property and production just wasn't working out because the estimates that they were making that this is the amount of food and crops we'll need, it wasn't correlated with the ground level, and people weren't able to get the products and crops that they actually required, which meant that people on the ground level were suffering in the Soviet Union. So they wanted to break free in the first place to begin with. But why did conflict happen? And this is structurally important. Number one, assimilation of culture. Soviet Union enforced their unionized identity on people which were from different cultures and different religions, and they wanted to protect their own customs and traditions. This was important for them because Soviet Union took control of their property and decided that these customs and traditions are not something that you can actually exercise control over. But secondarily and most importantly, when they took control of the land of the people were very unhappy because they couldn't decide what they wanted to do with this land. What is the impact of all of this? In their side of the world, when Soviet Union is still weak, people would still continue to engage in conflict with Soviet Union in the first place to begin with. This looks like people in Balkan countries fighting, but it also looks like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan still fighting with Soviet Union because people still see it as an opportunity that Soviet Union is weak, that we need our freedom. But what is the harm of all of this? The harm of all of this is that opening government assumes is that Soviet Union will act rationally. Why will they act rationally? They say because they care about economic prosperity. But what comes prior to economic prosperity? It's the existence which comes prior to economic prosperity. Within Soviet Union, within conflicts is going to increase in their side of the world because Soviet Union is forced to act act irrationally, because if people still continue to engage in conflict because of structural reasons that I've already given you, like assimilation of culture, like not exercising control over their land, what it inherently means is that conflict still increases, but Soviet Union is forced to clamp down on this conflict because Soviet Union cannot give away their core policies and core identity, because that is the basis of their existence in the first place to begin with. So economic control negotiations cannot happen because people were structurally fighting against the core principles of what it means to be a communist country in the first place, which means in their side of the world, when people still fight against Soviet Union, the Soviet Union is forced to act irrationally in the first place to begin with. OJ assumes that they act irrationally, but notice, when someone is going to take your power away, you want to curb them down, at least ensure that you're surviving in the short term, because if there's no survival and you don't have the power to even survive, you cannot do anything with the economic prosperity that happens in the future. It's logically prior that exists in our side of the world. But the second thing to note here, and what happened in our side of the world, we think smaller countries, even if they face some tension, they got the chance and the ability to grow in accordance with their own needs and own demands and own constraints. And how did this happen? Number one, they were able to transform imports and exports of how they needed it, and of like the goods and services which were important for them. Notice on the flip side, the Soviet Union was already a weak government, which is to say they couldn't see the specific needs of each area, which was different to each other, which is to say Balkan needs were different than Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan needs. If the needs of these areas were different in their side of the world, these needs never get expressed because the Soviet Union didn't have the capacity to look after these needs. In our side of the world, when smaller countries took over and control of this, it gives them the ability to ensure better contracts and trade relations for themselves, but ensure that people on the ground level actually got better quality of life by ensuring that trade relations in their side of the world. It meant that you got the ability to bring MNCs in your country. People got agency, POI, OG.
If all the reasons you give are true, Soviet Union would disintegrate automatically. Engage with the framing where it doesn't disintegrate.
Yeah. The point is, even if it doesn't disintegrate, that doesn't mean that people still don't want it to deintegrate, right? Which is to say, Soviet Union is still weak in their side of the world. People still see it as an opportunity to structurally fight against Soviet Union, which means they'll still protest, which means they'll still engage in conflict. But Soviet Union, to protect its identity, it will have to clamp them down even further, which means the agency of the people is clamped them down further, which means division increases, conflicts increases, internal stability decreases in their side of the world. But what happened in our side of the world? In our side of the world, these smaller countries got the opportunity to look at their own needs and demands. They got the opportunities to bring MNCs when and which they required, which is to say Estonia saw some amount of growth with their own allies. Different countries developed different allies. This meant that people on the ground level got better GDP, got better economy, got better exercise and control of their land, and it meant that they were able to exercise that. But the third thing and the most important thing also, if Soviet Union becomes strong in their side of the world, that means that proxy wars still increase. Why? Which is to say, when Soviet Union came down, that is where proxy wars and nuclear conflicts literally stopped, which means in their side of the world, Korean War and Berlin wars and like more proxy wars would have come up if Soviet Union was like more in power. In our side of the world, when in our side of the world, Soviet Union fell, it ended the Cold War, conflicts decreased, more proxy wars in their side of the world. People don't act rationally. You have to protect your core communist ideals. We are vertically a lot better than opening opposition. Very proud of us.
All right, I thank Emo for that very fine speech, inviting Gabbar to wrap the debate from closing off.
Am I clearly audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, POIs, I'll take from opening and I'll ask one myself, but if I don't, you can unmute post 5th minute. Medhavni going as government whip. Just starting. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The funny part about like CO's case is the reason that Soviet Union fell was because of negotiation. There are some people who wanted decentralization, some didn't. Gorbachev acted in a faster way. Soviet Union fell. So I'm just going to deal with why the most likely comparative is decentralization, why it's going to happen in the best way possible, and why Russia would not dominate this bloc. Second thing we're going to deal with is the best case. We're going to assume that probably these countries turn authoritarian. Why is it still better? But before that, what is our path to victory? We think the end goal for all of the houses is literally to make like the war-torn Eastern Europe far more better, more liberal, more democratic. But the problem that OGCG fell into is they never go ahead and like compare themselves to status quo. We have literal people dying at Yugoslavia. Every border has fucking conflicts. You have civil wars happening. People don't have like basic necessities, food isn't supplies, etc. So another amazing benefit at opposition, where you go ahead and talk about security, some autonomy, etc., etc. We're ready to concede that insofar on two metrics we win. One, in terms of gravity. Insofar we still assure that at a worst case, if it's like a Chinese situation of conceding personal liberty, you still have things like food security, shelter for people, which is something that OP does not deal with in status quo. But secondly, on vulnerability, just want to prove that it's going to be less polarization. Notice how most of the conflict in status quo are based on ideology. So this literally looks like Russia, Ukraine. This looks like the separation of Yugoslavia or the border conflicts, right? I think we take that away insofar we're able to offer that these countries are able to lead to lesser polarization insofar like USSR remains. Okay, cool. Let's deal with the idea like on CO, assuming that it turns into an authoritarian state. Why do we still feel it's better? I think first they just don't engage with like Shaura's idea on why US influence is so very important within status quo. So the entire idea of turning world into a democratic country just like makes US firstly go ahead and give weapons to a lot of countries in terms of fighting conflicts. This leads to a lot of like polarization. This leads to a lot of power that's like bestowed within countries who see oppression from communist regimes or dictatorial regimes in and of itself. It's simply this interventionist tendency that is played out in like multiple countries within Europe. But secondly, notice you cannot be just like dictatorial for a longer time and control populations as well. Insofar you're not even able to like offer them some sort of authoritarian minimals, which like OB wants to like talk about, right? Which looks like workers taking up arms. So it was like peasant participation that happened in massive numbers during imperial fight, even in India, right? So you had like just so we do think that eventually they have the capacity to go ahead and fight against USSR. But thirdly, workers literally can just go ahead and like escape into neighboring countries. Insofar geographically, Eastern Europe is literally like next to European Union, etc., right? Which is why we still think that during like Holodomor that happened in Russia, when basic necessities were taken away, you saw massive numbers of like farmers moving away and taking up arms in the first place. But lastly, and notice like what communism literally hinges upon. We think there are mechanisms like state and military that you really have to take control of. We think that eventually military all like these dictators also just lose support from military, right? Simply because they also have like sentiments associated to people struggling. They also just have like worse of situations with like on ground things like that. So this looks like the 1857 revolt in India for that matter, or during Russian Revolution when the monarch literally lost all of its support because military didn't want to support them because of oppression. We think then in our worst case scenario, and I'm just going to prove it's not likely, we still think that these people have some capacity to like fight back. CEOs out. On opening government, I think our extension is very simple. We just go ahead and prove that why our comparative is more likely. But I want to notice two things. One, in terms of weighing on realism, right? I think we go ahead and take higher burden, and why prove to you that there is just no inherent good governance as opposed to seeing it as like a historical surety. Where we go ahead and prove to you why it's likely going to happen, which brings me to our comparative, right? On the idea of decentralization. And notice how it's literally a flip of all of like Dhruw's like mechanisms, right? I think that the reason why decentralization becomes more likely is what fundamentally like most people oppose with the idea of like massive strain control. At that point of time when like Soviet Union was falling, how did it look like, right? One, I think and there was a lot of like polarization in terms of whether centralization or decentralization is better or worse and things like that. We think there were blocks around them. But secondly, we think that industries were failing because distribution of basic necessities were fucked up. We think most core issues were dealt by government, which people didn't like, but also like due to like cultural subjugation, there was a there was a control which led to a lot of dilemma amongst people in USSR. Right? I'll just take you. Which is why at all points of time we think it's likely then that these dictator like these people or Stalin etc. would have turned to more moderate form of decentralization. Two reasons. One, it becomes the biggest contention for all of the states, right? So the core principle of what holds USSR together are these contentions. Insofar you still want to be in power, you're likely to make these concessions for like your own personal reasons. But thirdly, at a point of time like power is distributed in a manner where you're still able to like get what you want out of the regime, you're likely to concede more. We don't think that these people who like are on top position like lose a lot, which is why concessions for people are more likely. I think in our worst case scenario, it's still better than status quo, where like these individual regimes just cannot like stay together. These are breaking up like every fucking year because of like internal conflicts. I think this comparative is winning on three metrics. One, in terms of nuance, right? We're going to like provide to you that irrespective of any sort of ideology, we win because we're able to prove decentralization. But secondly, on proportionality, we're able to prove to you like you benefit from state via all of these alternatives. But before that, opening POI.
All of your mechanism on decentralization still depends on different countries exercising different amount of control differently, right? But these still remain different dictatorships at the end of the day. You can't say that people can just go out or defect because there's an incentive to keep them within the country, because that's what dictatorship depends on.
I think first, the mech that I've given you, why it's just less likely going to turn into that oppressive is enough. But the second thing you probably need to focus upon is that like divulsion of more autonomy within this block is likely simply because like people in power still want to stay in power. I'm unsure as to why they will not concede if the alternative looks like literally falling apart or like crisis that happens in status quo. Insofar that's the case, we think that like it's more likely that they go ahead and concede to the demand, which is why we think like as opposed to OO, we directly on responsiveness clash to OO because their biggest contention is that unionization is a net bad. The second thing I want to talk about that even if there is like a concession on personal liberties insofar like these regimes probably limit them, we're still able to win it because like on opposition you still have people dying, you still have dictatorial regime, and ironically most post USSR state are still communist, still don't have a lot of autonomy, still haven't had a lot of liberal penetration. I think then panel, the way that we win this debate is proof to you that the sudden change that happened post Soviet Union collapse literally led to a missile solution for like most of Eastern Europe. We think it would like more liberalization etc would have been more slow probably in terms of case like China, that even if it's seen like a very closed up country, personal liberties are starting to like gain a lot of prominence. We see more interaction with US. I think this is what would have ideally happened with Eastern Europe, which is why we think it's better than status quo, which is why we think we win at CG.
All right, I thank Gabbar for that very fine speech, inviting PopVip to wrap up the debate whenever they're ready.
Yeah, I will just take 30 seconds max. Yeah, hi. Am I audible and visible both? Yeah, I'm perfect.
Yep.
Right, Aniket, going as op-whip. POS strictly via chat. Do not unmute yourselves, do not vocalize yourselves, do not use the raise hand feature, do not use your video and raise your hand physically. Just type it via chat. I'll take one from OG for sure. Around minute 4 or 5, it's completely fine if you spam the chat, I don't mind it. But I'll most likely take it around minute 4 or 5. If not OG, then CG. Any gender bronze work. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel and debates of this nature, almost everything that has been said by every other bench is speculative. OG is speculative to say that everything that is happening will be so rational that all the benefits will trickle down. O is so speculative to say that, oh, they will just go for a crackdown because legitimacy, etc., etc. CG is extremely speculative to go forward and just randomly assert that this decentralization happens, but also it happens in a fundamentally good way. I think first and foremost, the biggest issue that we face from CG is all their examples are not even relevant to fucking USSR at any point in time. Yugoslavia does not exist. Any other country that they name were never a part of USSR. But also, think of the counter, right? I can also go forward and name multiple examples. I can say Estonia becoming one of the biggest tech-rich countries in the world. I can go forward and list out the countries like Latvia, Lithuania, who have benefited a lot from their relations with the Europe. Simply then, what exactly is our part to victory, or what exactly is it that we have done so distinctly from O that we can actually take this debate away? I think O's mechanisms and or arguments that they want to protect the legitimacy, that is why they'll go forward and fight, etc., are anyway broken down by CG. What we do is logically more prior with respect to the idea of their core tenets and or core ideological principles. But secondly, it's so much prior that it's also based on the existence of USSR in and of itself. Which to say, why does USSR exist and or function in a particular manner? The moment we are able to prove that, we necessarily take it over OG at all points in time, because OG's argumentation and or impacts necessarily hinge on the fact that, these decisions will be so nice, I'll go for and be extremely nice, I'll act like one of the best fucking unions ever, which USSR will likely not do. Fundamentally, why? I think KD already proves all of that by going for and listing out 3 fundamental reasons. First and foremost, they are already involved in a multiple armed race and or other races with USA, which to say there are multiple facets of Cold Wars, which also means that it has already been uncontested by CG. CG never goes on and tries to argue on the rights of conflicts. I think conflicts of the level that happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s are much, much more bigger, but also they never prove why they would never happen in this world. Which to say, USR, even if it's decentralized, and that is their best case, which we are not willing to buy, of course, is still going to go for and fight in these wars, is still going to go and pump their resources in that manner, is still going to get fucked with the finance resources that they have. The moment they have finite resources by virtue of entering all of these arms and races, OG is out because I cannot redistribute all of that. But furthermore, the major funda behind the idea of USSR acting in a way is that almost all of it is controlled by Russia, which is to say the dictator comes from Russia and Russia wants to maintain control over each and every state that is a part of it, which also means they likely are more concerned with satisfying the people of Russia as opposed to satisfying the people of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Estonia, etc. The moment at time that is true, it means any and all ideas of decentralization that are pushed at OG first and foremost, never proven, never come forward, which means they can't just answer our POI by saying that, go forward, fucking prove it. They have to prove why exactly none of it happens. But secondly, and more importantly, KD also tells you something which is extremely distinct from whatever O says with respect to the idea of how states get to take control of what they want to do, of how these states that go forward and secede from the idea of USSR can go forward and necessarily derive what kind of economic outcomes they want to take. But also, and more importantly, KD points out the fucking referendum, which means people were not satisfied by USSR. People wanted to get out of it. And we directly clash with both governments when we go for and prove that to you. Why exactly? Look at it in this way. Estonia declared their independence in fucking 1988 or 89. And I'll draw a simple analogy with Yugoslavia. Serbia is the main idea in Yugoslavia. Russia is the main idea in USSR. Their main leaders function in a manner when they want to benefit themselves the most, which is their own territorial part, etc., which means other people in other countries like Kosovo, Croatia, etc., in Yugoslavia and Estonia, Bulgaria, Balkan region, etc., in USSR suffer a lot. Why exactly? Because you never get control over your resources. People are fundamentally disengaged and not associated with the idea of how exactly USSR functions at any point in time. The point in time, I don't have agency or autonomy to go forward and control how I wish to go with our economic policies, how I wish to go forward and use my land, how I wish to actually fucking exist in terms of my culture, is to say my identity is completely diluted just to be assimilated to USSR at every point in time. No gov bench has A, contested it, but B, they can't contest it, because in order to form that kind of unionization, it's important that I go forward and assimilate the culture in a manner that they come towards us. O never argues that. O's only argumentation is, USSR and China will be together. Russia, China are already together. I think CG beats them there as well, which means at large, I feel to understand what is the impact coming at we not only vertically take it better in terms of why these incentives are always present to crack down on people and or maintain themselves in a particular manner, but also give you 2 horizontal ideas with respect to the idea of why people do not get to take control of what they're doing. The smaller countries do not get to take control of how trade functions or what they want to do, which is to say, even if these ideas are bad, that it can lead to bad economic outcomes, they are never able to prove at any point in time. And this is for all 3 benches, that why merely having the power to go forward and control any and all usage of resources in and of itself for these small countries and their governments is good, which means that at the point that simply having that agency is good enough, I think we take that clash over every other bench. But lastly then, with respect to the idea of assimilation and why this cultural value is something that is extremely important, I'll take a POI from OG.
You assert that USSR is irrational as a fact. Give structural reasons why it is irrational.
We already gave you structural reasons. Listen to our member speech. A, USSR wants to engage and become a superpower. B, it goes for and engages in a Cold War. C, by virtue of which it leads to multiple bleedings of their own finances, of their own resources, by virtue of which they are never able to take rational decisions in the sense that, empirically proven, but also structural reasons that derive out of it. But lastly and more importantly, they're also not rational because they want to ensure that they're in They are in power of all of these nations that they are in control of. I think the moment at time that liberalization, I think that is stated by Gov, I don't understand why the USSR will exist in the manner that it does, of course, but B, why it will exist at all is to say fundamentally fragmentation happens on a much larger scale, which also means we take it over simply on the idea that they assert that fragmentation happens. We prove to you that fragmentation is much more easier in a decentralized world. But then lastly, we also tell you that people themselves did not want this to happen. People themselves wanted to get out of it. Look at the fucking referendum in 1991, which led to the dissolution of USSR at every point in time. Simply then, what are the metrics in terms of which we take it over this and we easily go to finals? First and foremost, each and every bench is speculative. We are extremely certain with the idea that A, we give agency to these countries to do what they want, but B, that leads to better relations for themselves, but also they get to decide how they want to build those relations or economic ideas. C, with respect to the idea of a very simple idea of where are people who are more vulnerable get it better. I think survival is the major idea that we discuss. That is logically prior to every other bench. At the point in time, we are able to prove that survival cannot happen because, of course, infinite resources do not exist and they've already bled out everything they had. But also they want to concentrate powers toward themselves, which means the assimilation of culture that they're trying to do necessarily leads to people, A, losing or diluting their identity, which is extremely important in terms of vulnerable groups suffering. But lastly, in terms of scale, I think in a scalar value, we impact the most amount of people when we prove to you that A, the smaller countries get to do what they want. B, Cold War in the manner that that happened continues to happen because more people suffer wars, more people are fucked with. But lastly then, and I think most importantly, even if you don't buy anything else that we are talking about, think about it in the most simplest manner. People never getting to control what they want to do. USSR always deciding naturally means that people will at any point in time go forward and fight against it, and USSR will have to maintain that authority over them. So then, if everything is not bought, if CO is considered to be extremely unoriginal in everything, just fucking by the fact that these small countries get to have agency, get to decide how they want to take their economics, get to decide how they want to read down on their culture. No other bench does this. Extremely proud to oppose. Votes CO.
All right. With that, we come to the end of the debate. I thank all for their very fine speech. I thank all the speakers for their speeches. I would ask the debaters and the spectators to leave the room so that the dialogue can be started.